The mob has no exit door. When you join, the understanding is permanent. You serve until you die, you go to prison, or you betray the people around you and spend the rest of your life hoping the organization you walked away from never finds you. There is no resignation letter, no quiet retirement, no handshake on the way out. The families on this list have murdered people for far less than what every single person here eventually did, and every one of them knew that when they made their decision. Some of them made deals with the federal government and disappeared into new identities in cities they had never heard of. Some wore wires against their own blood. Some sat in front of Senate committees with the entire country watching and said things that had never been said publicly before. One of them walked away from one of the most powerful crime families in America with no deal, no protection, and no federal handler standing between him and a death sentence, and survived anyway. The road out of the mob is rarely clean, and for most people, it does not exist at all. The 10 people on this list found it anyway, each in their own way, each paying a price that followed them long after they thought they were free. These are 10 people who escaped the mob and lived to tell it. Case 1. Henry Hill, Lucchese crime family, New York. The Goodfellas informant. Henry Hill grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in a neighborhood controlled by the Lucchese crime family. His father was Irish, his mother Sicilian, which meant under the strict Italian-American Mafia rules, he could never become a fully made member. But that barely mattered. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already running errands for Paul Vario, one of the most respected capos in the Lucchese family. He parked cars, carried messages, and fetched food. The men on the corner noticed him immediately. They gave him money. They gave him respect. Nobody touched him. For a kid growing up without much, that felt like everything. He never went back to school the same way after that. The mob became his classroom. Through his teenage years and into his 20s, Hill absorbed the rules of the life: who to trust, who to avoid, how to move money, how to stay quiet. He was never formally initiated, but he was treated as family. Paul Vario took him under his wing completely. Hill ran gambling operations, sold stolen goods, and participated in hijacking cargo from the airport. He was charming, quick, and useful. The family kept him close. In 1967, Hill was arrested and sentenced to 10 years for beating a man who owed gambling debts. The man happened to have a sister who worked at the FBI. Inside prison, Hill noticed something important. Mafia members were treated like royalty by both inmates and guards who had been paid off. He served only 4 years, was released in 1971, and came out more connected than when he went in. Through the 1970s, Hill's criminal activity expanded. He was involved in drug trafficking, moving cocaine from Brooklyn to Pittsburgh. He also took part in what became one of the most infamous heists in American history. On December 11, 1978, a crew connected to the Lucchese family walked into the Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport and walked out with approximately $5 million in cash and $800,000 in jewels. It was the largest cash robbery in United States history at the time. Hill was a key organizer. What followed the Lufthansa heist destroyed the crew from the inside. Jimmy Burke, one of Hill's closest partners, began systematically killing anyone connected to the robbery to prevent them from talking. Bodies piled up. Associates who had been promised shares of the money were found dead instead. Hill watched people he had worked with for years get murdered one by one. The paranoia inside the organization became suffocating. By 1980, Hill's cocaine addiction had spiraled out of control. His judgment was slipping. He was using the same people he was selling to, which was considered reckless and dangerous by the mob's standards. On May 2, 1980, he was arrested on narcotics trafficking charges in Nassau County, New York. Sitting in a police car, Hill understood immediately what the arrest meant. He was a liability. He knew too much. Burke had already been killing people for far less. Hill was not a made man, which meant there was no formal protection afforded to him. There was also a growing fear inside the family that he would talk. He beat them to it. Hill approached the FBI and offered everything he had: names, dates, operations, murders. He told investigators about the Lufthansa heist in detail. He described the internal workings of the Lucchese family's operations across New York. His testimony was direct and comprehensive. Over the following months and years, 50 people were convicted as a direct result of what Henry Hill told federal authorities. Paul Vario, the capo who had protected and mentored Hill since childhood, was convicted and sentenced to prison, where he died in 1988. Jimmy Burke was convicted of murder and died in prison in 1996. Hill and his wife Karen, along with their 2 children, Greg and Gina, entered the Federal Witness Protection Program in 1980. They were given new identities and relocated repeatedly. Over 7 years, they were moved approximately 10 times to cities including Omaha, Nebraska, Independence, Kentucky, and Redmond, Washington. Marshals woke the family in the middle of the night on more than one occasion and moved them immediately after receiving word that hitmen were coming. The Lucchese family had placed a bounty on Hill's head worth over $1 million. Life inside witness protection was unstable. Hill never fully let go of the habits that had defined his entire adult life. He continued using drugs. He continued making money through illegal means. In 1987, he was arrested in Seattle, Washington for cocaine trafficking. That arrest ended his formal participation in the program. He and his family were removed. In 1985, journalist Nicholas Pileggi had published a book called Wise Guy, based on extensive interviews with Hill. Martin Scorsese adapted the book into Goodfellas, released in 1990. The film, in which Ray Liotta portrayed Hill, became one of the most celebrated crime films ever made. It received 6 Academy Award nominations. Hill was reportedly paid around $550,000 for his participation in the project. The fame that followed did not stabilize his life. He was arrested multiple times through the 1990s and 2000s, including for methamphetamine possession in Nebraska in 2004. He struggled with alcohol for much of his later years and spoke openly about it in multiple public interviews. He appeared frequently on the Howard Stern radio show, often sounding visibly impaired. Karen filed for divorce, which was finalized in 2002 after a legal separation that had gone on for years. In his final years, Hill lived in Los Angeles with his partner Lisa Caserta. He wrote a cookbook, made television appearances, and worked to become certified as a drug and alcohol counselor. He also collaborated on a book about the Lufthansa heist, published after his death. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012, one day after his 69th birthday, from complications related to long-standing heart problems. The Lucchese family never carried out the contract on him. By the time he died, most of the people who had wanted him dead were already dead themselves, or serving life sentences that would end the same way. 50 people went to prison because Henry Hill could not stop talking. Whether that makes him a hero or a rat depends entirely on which side of the table you were sitting on. Henry Hill got out because he had no other choice and made it work for 32 years. The next person on this list was not running from a murder charge or a drug arrest. He was running from the man who was supposed to be his closest ally. And when he decided to talk, he brought down the most powerful crime boss in the United States. Case 2. Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gambino crime family, New York. The man who brought down John Gotti. Salvatore Gravano was born on March 12, 1945, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a neighborhood with a heavily Italian-American population and deep roots in organized crime. He was a difficult kid from early on, held back twice in school, labeled a slow learner, and constantly getting into fights. He later attributed much of his childhood rage to severe dyslexia that went undiagnosed and untreated. At 10 years old, local gangsters watched him take on several older boys who had stolen his bicycle. One of the men remarked that the small kid fought like a little bull. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life. By his teenage years, Gravano was already drifting into serious criminal activity. He was not recruited into the mob so much as he gravitated toward it naturally. Violence came easily to him. He became affiliated first with the Colombo crime family as a young associate, and later transitioned into the Gambino family, which at the time was becoming the most powerful organized crime organization in the United States. Gravano was formally inducted as a made member of the Gambino family in the late 1970s. He built his criminal empire primarily through construction, controlling mob-connected companies across New York City, extracting payments from businesses, managing union rackets, and ensuring that construction projects throughout the 5 boroughs paid tribute to the family. He was a competent earner and a loyal soldier, which accelerated his rise through the ranks. He was also a killer. Over the course of his time in the Gambino family, Gravano participated in at least 19 murders. He carried out hits himself, ordered others, and assisted in the planning of executions. One of the most consequential killings he was involved in happened on December 16, 1985, outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. That evening, Gambino boss Paul Castellano and his driver Tommy Valachi arrived at the restaurant for a meeting. As they stepped out of their car, 4 gunmen shot both men dead on the street. John Gotti had orchestrated the entire operation. Gravano was one of the key figures who helped plan it, and he sat in a car with Gotti nearby as the shooting happened. The 2 men drove slowly past the bodies afterward. Castellano was gone. Gotti was now the boss of the Gambino family, and Gravano was positioned directly beside him. Throughout the late 1980s, Gravano served as Gotti's underboss, his second-in-command and most trusted enforcer. The 2 men were inseparable publicly and ran the family together. Gotti became known as the Dapper Don, constantly photographed in expensive suits, giving sound bites to reporters outside his home in Howard Beach, Queens. Gravano stayed less visible, but handled the operational side of the business. The FBI had been watching both of them for years. Agents planted listening devices inside the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, which Gotti used as a meeting place. Those recordings captured Gotti speaking openly about murders, family business, and his own associates. On one set of recordings, Gotti was heard speaking badly about Gravano, criticizing him, complaining about him, and, in some interpretations, suggesting he was becoming a problem. In December 1990, Gotti and Gravano were arrested together. Both were charged with murder and racketeering. The evidence against them was substantial. The prosecution had the surveillance recordings from the Ravenite. They had Gotti's own voice describing crimes. Federal agents approached Gravano in jail and played him the tapes of Gotti talking about him. Whatever loyalty Gravano had left began to collapse. On November 13, 1991, Salvatore Gravano formally agreed to testify against John Gotti. He became the first member of the upper hierarchy of a New York crime family to turn informant. In exchange, he confessed to his involvement in 19 murders and agreed to plead guilty to a single racketeering charge. The government offered him a dramatically reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. The trial began in January 1992. Gravano took the witness stand and dismantled the prosecution's case against the Teflon Don, the nickname Gotti had earned for walking out of 3 previous federal trials. He provided detailed, first-hand testimony about murders, the inner structure of the Gambino family, and the specific crimes Gotti had committed or ordered. Gotti's defense attorneys attacked Gravano relentlessly, pointing to his own admitted crimes, his 19 murders, and his obvious motive to reduce his sentence. The jury did not acquit. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all counts. 5 murders, conspiracy to commit murder, loan sharking, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in prison of cancer on June 10, 2002. Gravano received 5 years for his cooperation. He served his sentence and was released in 1995. He was placed in witness protection and given a new identity and plastic surgery. He moved to Arizona with his family under an assumed name. He lasted in that new life for about 5 years before unraveling it himself. In February 2000, Gravano, his son Gerard, his wife Deborah, and his daughter Karen were all arrested on federal and state drug charges. Gravano had built a massive ecstasy trafficking ring in Arizona, moving pills through a network that stretched back to New York. The irony was direct. He was brought down by informants inside his own drug operation, exactly the same mechanism he had used against Gotti. Both Gravano and his son pleaded guilty in June 2001. In September 2002, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for the New York charges. A concurrent 19-year sentence was handed down in Arizona. He was released from an Arizona prison in September 2017 at the age of 72. He had served nearly 2 decades for the drug convictions, which erased most of the goodwill the federal government had extended to him in 1992. Since his release, Gravano has been notably public. He runs a YouTube channel and a podcast where he discusses his life in the mob, his relationship with Gotti, and the events that led to his cooperation. He has spoken at length about the murders he committed and has shown little visible remorse in many of those interviews. Families of his victims have repeatedly spoken out against his public profile, pointing out that a man who confessed to 19 killings has been given a media platform that most of his victims never had. He remains alive, well into his 70s, living in what is reported to be an undisclosed location. The Gambino family never successfully retaliated against him. The organization that Gotti had turned into a media spectacle was left crippled after the 1992 convictions, with dozens of its top members either imprisoned or in the process of being prosecuted. There was no functioning apparatus capable of executing a revenge hit, even if the will existed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gravano escaped the mob by destroying it from the inside, then spent the next decade rebuilding the same kind of criminal life he had supposedly left behind. Henry Hill could not fully leave either, but the next person on this list did something neither of them managed. He walked away from one of New York's most powerful crime families with no deal, no protection program, and no FBI handler standing between him and a death sentence. Case 3. Michael Franzese, Colombo crime family, New York. The only boss who walked away. Michael Franzese was born on May 27, 1951, in Brooklyn, New York. His father was John Franzese, the underboss of the Colombo crime family, one of New York's 5 major mafia families. Growing up, Michael watched his father constantly surrounded by law enforcement attention. Police were always nearby. His name appeared in newspapers regularly. John Franzese was, by any measure, one of the most feared and respected figures in New York organized crime. His son grew up understanding exactly what that world looked like from the inside. Despite the environment, Michael initially chose a different path. He enrolled at Hofstra University in a pre-medical program. He wanted to become a doctor. That plan ended in 1967 when his father was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 50 years in federal prison. Michael was 16 years old. His mother was devastated. The family lost its primary source of income and stability. Michael left university and made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of his life. He would go to work to support the family and help fund the legal efforts to get his father released. That decision put him directly inside the Colombo crime family's operations. He began working his way up through the organization through the early 1970s. He was formally inducted as a made member on Halloween in 1975, skipping ahead of a long line of other candidates out of respect for his father's standing. By the late 1970s, he had built a crew of roughly 300 people and was operating a range of legitimate and illegitimate businesses simultaneously: car dealerships, restaurants, nightclubs, leasing companies, auto repair shops, movie production companies, travel agencies, and video stores. Then came the gasoline scheme. In the early 1980s, Franzese was approached by an insider with a straightforward proposition. The federal government collected taxes on gasoline sales. If a company collected those taxes from customers and then simply never paid them to the government before declaring bankruptcy and disappearing, the money was effectively stolen. New companies could be created and the cycle repeated. The operation required a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and people willing to move fast and stay quiet. Franzese built exactly that. The operation ran through a network of approximately 18 companies registered in Panama, with wholesale licenses and sophisticated accounting structures. In the first week alone, the scheme generated $320,000. At its peak, Franzese claimed it was producing up to $10 million per week. Federal investigators later described it as the most profitable single criminal operation run by the American Mafia since Al Capone's bootlegging empire during Prohibition. In 1986, Fortune magazine published its list of the 50 wealthiest and most powerful mafia bosses in the United States. Michael Franzese was ranked 18th. Vanity Fair separately described him as one of the biggest earners in the mob since Al Capone. The scheme collapsed when Franzese's business partner became a government informant. Federal investigators now had a clear picture of what had been happening. In 1986, Franzese was convicted on federal racketeering and conspiracy charges and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released on parole in 1989 after serving approximately 3.5 years. At that point, something had already shifted inside him. During his time in prison, he had married Camille Garcia, a woman he had met in 1984 while filming a movie in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Camille was a devout Christian. Her faith and her direct influence on him during his incarceration had pushed Franzese toward a serious re-examination of his life. He studied multiple religions during a period of solitary confinement: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism. He eventually concluded that he would follow Christianity. When he was released in 1989, he moved to California with Camille. He did not enter witness protection. He did not make a deal with the government. He did not testify against anyone. He simply informed the Colombo family that he was done. Every credible expert on organized crime who was asked about this move said the same thing: he would not survive it. An acting boss did not walk away from a major crime family and live. The code was absolute. You were in until you were dead, in prison, or cooperating with the government. Franzese had chosen none of those exits. What followed was genuinely unusual. In 1991, he was arrested again, this time on a tax fraud accusation, and sent back to federal prison for a parole violation. He served additional time, was released in 1994, and moved back to California permanently. No assassination attempt came. No contract was successfully executed against him. His father, John Franzese, reportedly approved a contract on his son when word spread that Michael was leaving, the assumption being that anyone departing the family without authorization must be cooperating with authorities. That contract was never carried out. Michael has stated publicly that he refused to comply with a federal subpoena to testify against another individual and instead accepted additional prison time for the parole violation rather than give information to prosecutors. That decision, he believes, removed much of the suspicion that he had turned informant and reduced the pressure on the family to act against him. He has also been candid about why the family ultimately chose not to kill him. He never testified against anyone, Every person he had worked with was either dead, already in prison for life, or had been convicted on the basis of evidence that had nothing to do with Franzese. By the time the threat level was assessed, there was essentially nothing left to protect by killing him, and considerable risk attached to attempting it. Since his release in 1994, Franzese has built an entirely different public life. He became a motivational speaker, an author, and a Christian minister working with at-risk youth and people with criminal backgrounds. He wrote several books, including Blood Covenant in 2003, which detailed his life inside the Colombo family and the events that led to his departure. He has appeared on numerous major television programs, including The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and 48 Hours. In June 2020, he launched a YouTube channel that had exceeded 1.9 million subscribers by February 2026. He lives in Newport Beach, California with Camille. He has 7 children. The recognition he receives from organized crime historians and law enforcement analysts is consistent. He is described as the only high-ranking official of a major American crime family to walk away from the mob without entering witness protection and without being murdered. Whether that outcome was the result of his faith, his strategic decisions, his family connections, or simply the weakened state of the Colombo family by the mid-1990s is a question that has no clean answer. John Franzese, his father, died in 2020 at the age of 103, one of the longest-lived senior mafia figures in American history. Michael outlived the world his father built. Franzese left the mob with no government protection and survived because of a combination of calculation and circumstances that will almost certainly never align the same way again. The next person on this list had no choice in the matter at all. He was already a teenager working for the Sicilian Cosa Nostra when the war that would eventually force him to talk began killing everyone around him. Case 4. Tommaso Buscetta, Sicilian Mafia, Cosa Nostra, Italy / USA. The man who broke the Sicilian Code. Tommaso Buscetta was born on July 13, 1928, in Palermo, Sicily, the youngest of 17 children. His father was a glazier. The family was poor, and Palermo in the late 1920s and 1930s was a city where poverty and organized crime were woven tightly together. Buscetta grew up in Calza, one of the most deprived neighborhoods in the city, and by the time he was a teenager, the Sicilian Mafia had already become the most powerful institutional force in his daily life. He became involved in criminal activity as a young man and was formally inducted into the Sicilian Cosa Nostra in 1945 at 17 years old. He was not a low-level street criminal who stumbled into the organization. Buscetta rose steadily through the ranks of the Porta Nuova Mandamento, one of the territorial divisions of the Sicilian Mafia, and became a full-fledged member involved primarily in cigarette smuggling in his early years. He was sharp, multilingual, and adaptable, which allowed him to operate across multiple countries. Over the following decades, he moved between Italy, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Mexico, Switzerland, and the United States, building criminal connections on multiple continents. In the United States, he developed significant ties to the Gambino crime family in New York. His personal life was complicated by the nature of the world he lived in. He married 3 times. He had numerous children. He was a man who, by all accounts, understood the Mafia not as a simple criminal enterprise, but as a culture with its own history, rituals, and internal logic. He believed in what he called the old rules, a code of conduct that separated legitimate Mafia activity from the kind of wholesale brutality that was coming. The brutality arrived in the form of Salvatore Riina. Riina was the boss of the Corleonesi clan, a faction from the interior of Sicily that had spent years building power and was now ready to take over the entire organization. In the early 1980s, Riina launched what became known as the Second Mafia War, a systematic campaign to eliminate every rival faction within Cosa Nostra. The killing was not surgical. It was total. Entire families were wiped out. Bosses, underbosses, associates, and their relatives were murdered in rapid succession. Rina's strategy was to destroy the existing power structure completely and replace it with his own people. Buscetta was in Brazil when the war began. He had fled Italy in 1980 after being granted conditional release from prison and immediately escaped rather than report back to authorities. He knew what was coming. But being in Brazil did not protect the people he had left behind in Sicily. On September 11, 1982, both of Buscetta's sons from his first marriage, Benedetto and Antonio, disappeared. They were never found again. What happened to them was never officially resolved, but within the Mafia world, their fate was understood immediately. They'd been killed on Rina's orders as a way of punishing and destabilizing Buscetta. In the months that followed, the losses continued. His brother Vincenzo was murdered. His son-in-law, Giuseppe Genova, was killed. His brother-in-law, Pietro, was killed. 4 of his nephews, Domenico Buscetta, Benedetto Buscetta, Orazio D'Amico, and Antonio D'Amico, were all murdered. Multiple close allies, including the respected boss Stefano Bontade, were killed as well. Buscetta attempted suicide by swallowing a large quantity of barbiturates while in custody in Brazil. He survived. When he recovered, he made the decision that would change the course of Italian legal history. He was arrested in Sao Paulo on October 23, 1983, and extradited to Italy on June 28, 1984. He asked to speak with Giovanni Falcone, the Sicilian anti-mafia judge who had been building cases against Cosa Nostra for years. Falcone agreed to meet him. What followed was 45 consecutive days of testimony that Falcone later described as the most significant breakthrough in the history of the Italian state's fight against organized crime. Buscetta explained everything. The internal structure of Cosa Nostra, the commission, the governing body that oversaw decisions between the major families, the initiation rituals, the rules that governed membership, promotion, and execution, the specific roles and identities of senior figures within the organization. He described how decisions were made, how murders were authorized, and how the organization maintained its control over Sicilian society through a combination of economic power, political corruption, and violence. This body of testimony became known as the Buscetta theorem, a comprehensive framework for understanding how Cosa Nostra actually functioned, which prosecutors had never previously possessed in such detail. He drew a clear distinction between himself and Rina. Buscetta insisted throughout his testimony that he was not a pentito, the Italian term for a repentant mafia informant, in the conventional sense. He did not consider himself to be betraying the mafia as he had known it. He considered Rina to have already destroyed that organization. What he was betraying, he argued, was a corrupted version of something that no longer deserved loyalty. Whether that framing was genuine or self-serving is a question historians and criminologists have debated ever since. What is not debatable is the impact. In December 1984, Buscetta was extradited to the United States, where he received American citizenship and was placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program in exchange for further testimony against the American Mafia. He testified in the Pizza Connection trial in New York in 1985, a case that targeted Sicilian-American mobsters accused of using pizza restaurants across the United States as fronts for a massive heroin trafficking network. The trial resulted in convictions of multiple defendants, including Gaetano Badalamenti, a former top boss of the Sicilian Mafia. His most consequential contribution to Italian justice came at the Maxi trial, held in Palermo between 1986 and 1987. It was the largest anti-mafia trial in history, with 475 defendants prosecuted simultaneously in a specially constructed bunker courtroom. Buscetta's testimony was the foundation of the prosecution's case. The trial resulted in 360 convictions and over 2,665 years of combined sentences handed down to Cosa Nostra members. After the murders of judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992, both killed by Cosa Nostra car bombs in separate attacks, Buscetta came forward again. He provided additional testimony to the Italian Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission, this time addressing what he knew about the connections between senior mafia figures and Italian politicians. These statements were among the most politically explosive testimony ever given in Italian legal proceedings. He remained in the United States Witness Protection Program for the rest of his life. He died on April 2, 2000, in the United States from cancer. He was 71 years old. His third wife and surviving children continued to live in anonymity, still protected, still fearful of reprisal, years after his death.
Salvatore Riina, the man responsible for killing Buscetta's sons, nephews, brother, and allies, was arrested in Palermo in January 1993. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in November 2017, never having shown any public remorse. Buscetta lost nearly every member of his family before he decided to talk. The next person on this list made his decision under completely different circumstances, not because of grief, but because of pure terror, sitting in a federal prison cell while the man who wanted him dead slept 50 feet away. Case 5. Joseph Valachi, Genovese crime family, New York. The first man to break omerta in public. Joseph Michael Valachi was born on September 22, 1904, in East Harlem, New York City. His parents were Italian immigrants from Cervinara in the Campania region of southern Italy. His father was a violent alcoholic. The family was poor and the neighborhood was rough, and Valachi later pointed to both of those facts as the foundation of everything that came after. He dropped out of school early and began stealing almost immediately. His first gang was called the Minutemen, named not for patriotism, but for how quickly they could break into a place and get out. Valachi was the driver, and his ability to move fast under pressure made him valuable. He was arrested for grand larceny in 1921, arrested again in 1923, and sentenced to 18 months at Sing Sing prison for attempted burglary, though he served only 9 months. By the time he came out, he had been replaced in his old crew and formed a new burglary gang of his own. He kept stealing, kept getting arrested, and kept getting back out. His criminal record through the 1920s was long but unremarkable, the biography of a street thief who had not yet found his direction. That direction arrived in 1930 when Valachi was formally inducted as a made member of the American Mafia. He was brought in as a soldier in what was then called the Reina family, later known as the Lucchese family. His induction happened during one of the most violent periods in the history of American organized crime, the Castellamarese War, a bloody power struggle between rival mafia factions led by Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Valachi fought on the Maranzano side, which ultimately won after Masseria was assassinated in April 1931. After the war ended, Valachi transferred his allegiance to the Genovese family, where he became a soldier under the command of Vito Genovese himself. For the next 3 decades, Valachi ran numbers operations, participated in gambling rackets, and was suspected by federal investigators of involvement in more than 20 murders. He was not a boss or a capo. He was a street-level soldier, a working member of the organization who carried out orders and kept his head down. He understood the rules completely. The most important rule was omerta, the code of silence. You did not talk. Not to police, not to prosecutors, not to anyone outside the family. The penalty for breaking it was death, and that penalty was enforced without exception. In 1959, Valachi was convicted of narcotics trafficking and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. Vito Genovese, his own boss, was already there serving a sentence for drug trafficking. Inside the same federal facility, the two men occupied the same world, the same yards, the same common areas, the same institutional rhythms. For most people, having their boss nearby in prison might have felt like protection. For Valachi, it became a source of escalating dread. Rumors had been circulating inside the prison that Valachi was talking to federal agents. He was not, at least not yet. But the rumors were enough. Other Genovese family soldiers inside the prison began treating him differently. He was shunned at the lunch table that had previously been reserved for New York mob members. People tried to maneuver him into the shower room, a confined space with no witnesses and a long history as a location for prison murders. Valachi stopped bathing rather than risk being cornered. A Genovese lieutenant smuggled him a steak sandwich, and Valachi, convinced it was poisoned, threw it away, and from that point forward refused to eat anything that was not factory sealed. Then Vito Genovese called him over. In front of witnesses, Genovese spoke to Valachi in the indirect, parable-heavy way that senior mob figures communicated serious things without saying them directly. He spoke about a barrel of apples and what happens when one bad apple is left inside with the good ones. Then he kissed Valachi on the cheek. A Genovese lieutenant standing nearby told Valachi quietly what the kiss meant. It was the kiss of death. Genovese had just publicly marked him for execution. Valachi's response was to panic completely. On June 22, 1962, working near a construction site in the prison yard, Valachi picked up a metal pipe that had been left lying on the ground. He spotted a man he believed to be Joseph de Palermo, the Mafia member he was convinced Genovese had contracted to kill him. He approached the man from behind and beat him to death with the pipe. The man he killed was not de Palermo. His name was John Joseph Sopp, and he was an ordinary inmate with no connection to the Genovese family whatsoever. Valachi had killed the wrong man entirely. Now facing a murder charge on top of his existing narcotics sentence and potentially the death penalty, Valachi made his decision. He approached federal authorities and offered to tell them everything he knew about the American Mafia. What he knew was substantial. In October 1963, Valachi testified before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator John McClellan of Arkansas. The hearings were televised nationally. Valachi became the first made member of the Italian-American Mafia to publicly acknowledge its existence in any setting. He sat before the cameras and told the United States Senate and the watching American public that a nationwide criminal organization existed, that it was called Cosa Nostra, that it had a formal structure with bosses, underbosses, capos, and soldiers, that it had initiation rituals involving blood oaths, and that it operated across multiple cities through a network of connected families. None of this had been confirmed publicly before. Law enforcement agencies had suspected the organization's existence, but the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had for years officially denied that a national crime syndicate existed. Valachi's testimony made that denial impossible to maintain. His evidence directly contradicted the official position and forced a fundamental shift in how the federal government approached organized crime. The immediate legal impact was limited. Few Mafia members were prosecuted directly as a result of what Valachi said on the stand. His knowledge was deep in some areas and shallow in others, and his account of events sometimes relied on memory and interpretation rather than documentary evidence. But the broader consequences were enormous. His testimony provided the political momentum that led to the creation of the Federal Witness Protection Program and contributed directly to the eventual passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in 1970, known as RICO,
which became the most powerful legal tool ever developed for prosecuting organized crime in the United States. Valachi was moved to the La Tuna Federal Correctional Institution in Texas, north of El Paso, where he lived for the remainder of his life under protective custody. He wrote a lengthy autobiography in prison called The Real Thing, which journalist Peter Moss used as source material for the 1968 book The Valachi Papers, later adapted into a film. A $100,000 bounty placed on his head by the Mafia remained active until the day he died. Joseph Valachi died of a heart attack at La Tuna on April 3, 1971. He was 66 years old. He had spent the last 9 years of his life inside federal custody, protected from the organization he had served for 3 decades. Valachi broke omerta in a Senate chamber with cameras rolling and the entire country watching. The next person on this list did something that required a completely different kind of nerve. He did not just inform on the mob from the outside, he lived inside it for 6 years as someone else entirely, and the people who trusted him most never suspected a thing until it was too late. Case 6. Joe Pistone, FBI agent Donnie Brasco, Bonanno crime family, New York. The FBI agent who lived inside the mob for 6 years. Joseph Pistone was born in 1939 in Erie, Pennsylvania, to an Italian-American family with roots in Calabria and Sicily. He grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, a blue-collar city with a significant Italian-American population and enough mob presence that Pistone absorbed the culture, the language, and the behavioral patterns of organized crime simply by growing up around them. He attended Paterson State College, earned a degree in anthropology in 1965, taught briefly at a local school, and then spent 3 years working for the Office of Naval Intelligence before being sworn into the FBI on July 7, 1969. He was assigned initially to Jacksonville, Florida, then transferred to New York in 1974 to work in the truck and hijack unit. He showed an immediate aptitude for undercover work. His first significant operation involved infiltrating a ring of heavy vehicle thieves, which resulted in more than 30 arrests. The FBI noticed what he could do when given the room to disappear into a role. In the spring of 1976, Pistone volunteered for something considerably more dangerous. He proposed infiltrating one of New York's 5 mafia families from the inside, posing as a street-level criminal rather than operating from a distance using informants and wiretaps. No FBI agent had ever done this before. The operation was given the code name Sun Apple, combining sunny Miami and the Big Apple in New York, the 2 cities where it would simultaneously run. The FBI built Pistone a complete false identity. He became Donald Brasco, known as Donnie, a low-level jewel thief from Miami with a background in burglary and a working knowledge of the gem trade. To make that knowledge credible, Pistone spent weeks studying gemology, learning to assess diamonds and other stones with enough fluency to withstand scrutiny from people who had been in the business for years. The FBI erased his name from office rolls entirely. Anyone who called asking for Joseph Pistone would be told no one by that name worked there. In September 1976, Donnie Brasco effectively replaced Joseph Pistone. The operation was initially planned to last around 6 months. It lasted nearly 6 years. Pistone began appearing in the bars and social clubs of Little Italy in Manhattan, presenting himself as a connected guy looking for opportunities. The mob world operates on introductions and vouching. You do not simply walk in and become trusted. It takes time, and it takes someone already inside to bring you forward. That person became Benjamin Ruggiero, a hitman and longtime soldier in the Bonanno crime family, who went by the nickname Lefty Two Guns. Ruggiero had been in the mob for decades, had killed more than 20 people by his own account, and had never risen above soldier despite years of service. He took a liking to Donnie Brasco and became his sponsor, the person who vouched for him inside the family and whose life was now staked on Brasco being exactly who he claimed to be. Under Mafia rules, if Brasco turned out to be an agent or informant, Ruggiero would be killed for bringing him in. Through Ruggiero, Pistone was introduced to the wider Bonanno family network and to elements of other families operating in New York and Florida. He participated in the day-to-day work of mob life: loan sharking, extortion, fencing stolen goods, illegal gambling. He assisted in hijacking operations involving tractor-trailers loaded with high-value cargo. He operated an illegal bottle club in Tampa, Florida, called the King's Court, run alongside senior Bonanno members Dominic Napolitano and Ruggiero, which served as a front for gambling, stolen property transactions, and drug dealing. Pistone submitted intelligence to the FBI through carefully managed contact sessions, maintaining his cover between meetings by living the life completely. He had a separate apartment in New York and accommodations in Florida. His wife, Maggie, and their 3 daughters were relocated far away and had virtually no contact with him for extended periods. The separation was enormous, and the strain on his marriage was severe. There were stretches where his own FBI colleagues, watching him on surveillance from a distance, assumed he was just another mobster. The operation deepened further than anyone had anticipated. By the early 1980s, Pistone had penetrated the upper levels of the Bonanno family. Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black, had risen to a position of significant authority within the family and had taken Donnie Brasco under his personal wing. Within the family's internal discussions, plans were being made to formally induct Brasco as a made member. The ceremony was being arranged. To become made, a candidate was traditionally required to have committed a murder. Napolitano ordered Pistone to kill a specific target in Florida as proof of his readiness. The FBI faced a direct problem. They could not allow their agent to commit a murder. They attempted to locate the intended target and remove him from the situation before Pistone was forced to act. The target could not be found in time. The pressure on Pistone mounted. The agency began making plans to extract him. On July 26, 1981, the FBI pulled Pistone out of the operation. Agents approached Sonny Black directly and informed him that Donnie Brasco was an FBI agent. Black reportedly struggled to accept what he was hearing. The man he had personally sponsored, promoted, and trusted had been federal law enforcement the entire time. Within weeks, Napolitano was called to a meeting by the Bonanno family leadership. He handed his jewelry and personal belongings to a friend beforehand, a gesture in the Mafia world that signals a man knows he is not coming back. He was murdered. His hands were cut off, a symbolic punishment for having vouched for an agent and brought him inside. His body was found in a Staten Island marsh in 1982. Benjamin Ruggiero, the man who had first sponsored Donnie Brasco, was arrested before the family could reach him. He was convicted on charges stemming from the Pistone operation and died in prison in 1994. The evidence Pistone gathered during 6 years undercover produced more than 200 indictments and over 100 convictions. The Bonanno family was severely damaged, its leadership decimated, its operations exposed, its reputation inside the broader Mafia world destroyed. The family was actually removed from the commission, the governing body of the New York families, for a period as a direct consequence of having been infiltrated so completely. A $500,000 open contract was placed on Pistone's head by the Bonanno family. That contract has never been formally withdrawn. Pistone has lived under a secret identity in an undisclosed location since leaving the operation in 1981. His wife and daughters remain in hiding as well. He wrote a book about his experience in 1988 titled Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia, which became a bestseller. The 1997 film Donnie Brasco, starring Johnny Depp as Pistone and Al Pacino as Ruggiero, was based on his account. Pistone served as a technical advisor on the production. In interviews over the years, Pistone has reflected on the psychological cost of the operation. maintaining a false identity for 6 years, building genuine relationships with men he knew he was going to destroy, watching the consequences play out in real time. He has stated that he came out the same person he went in, and that his values and sense of identity never shifted. The FBI credited him with pioneering the use of deep undercover agents as a tool against organized crime, a technique that was subsequently used repeatedly with significant effect. Pistone survived by never being who he said he was. The next person on this list survived by doing something almost no one in Mafia history had ever managed. He was already the boss, already inside, already trusted completely, and he still found a way out. Case 7. Jimmy, Fratianno, Los Angeles crime family / Chicago outfit. The acting boss who flipped. Aladina Fratianno was born in Naples, Italy on November 14, 1913. His family emigrated to the United States when he was an infant and settled in Cleveland, Ohio, in the city's Little Italy neighborhood. He hated his given name immediately and insisted from childhood on being called Jimmy. He grew up in a neighborhood where organized crime was a visible and functional part of daily life, and he gravitated toward it without hesitation. He was a thief by his early teens and a street criminal by the time he was a young adult. His path into the mob was not complicated. He was simply the kind of person the mob was always looking for. He was fearless, capable of violence, and willing to do what was asked of him without asking too many questions. He earned his nickname early. The Weasel was not a compliment. It referred to his cunning, his ability to slip out of difficult situations, and a certain quality of unpredictability that made people around him slightly uneasy even when things were going well. He wore it anyway. Fratianno became affiliated with the Cleveland organized crime world in his early years and eventually made his way into the broader national network of La Cosa Nostra. He was formally inducted as a made member and spent years operating across multiple cities, developing connections with crime families in Los Angeles, Cleveland, and eventually the Chicago outfit. He was not a man who stayed in one place or worked for one organization exclusively. He moved where the opportunities were and made himself useful to whoever needed someone with his particular skill set. That skill set included murder. Over the course of his criminal career, Fratianno admitted to personally committing 5 murders and participating in 6 others. He carried out contract killings, assisted in executions, and operated as an enforcer across multiple jurisdictions. He was not squeamish about the work and developed a reputation as someone who could be relied upon to complete an assignment cleanly. By 1975, the Los Angeles crime family was in a weakened state. Its boss, Dominic Brooklier, was sentenced to prison that year. The family needed leadership. Fratianno was offered a significant role. He would serve as co-acting boss of the Los Angeles family, alongside Louis Tom Dragna, while Brooklier was incarcerated. To take the position, he transferred his membership from the Chicago outfit back to the Los Angeles family. He was now, technically, one of the highest-ranking active mafia figures in the United States. His time as acting boss was productive in terms of operations, but deeply unstable in terms of internal politics. Fratianno worked to rebuild the Los Angeles family's reputation, which had been considered weak for years. He traveled the country, making connections and establishing relationships with other families. But the arrangement with Dragna was tense, and the situation became significantly more complicated when Brooklier was released from prison in October 1976 and immediately began challenging Fratianno's version of events regarding who had actually been in charge. The relationship deteriorated quickly. Brooklier began telling people that Fratianno had never legitimately held the acting boss position. He accused him of running a separate crew without authorization. Fratianno read the situation correctly. Brooklier was laying the groundwork to justify having him killed. Then came the contract that changed everything. Fratianno was approached with an order to kill Frank Bompensiero, one of his few genuine friends inside the organization. Bompensiero was suspected of being an FBI informant. The suspicion was correct. He was. But Fratianno stalled. He could not bring himself to kill the man. He delayed for months, making excuses, buying time, until other associates eventually carried out the murder themselves in February 1977. The fact that Fratianno had hesitated was noticed. It created additional suspicion about where his loyalties actually lay. The final piece fell into place at a mob wake for Cleveland mobster Tony Del Santer in 1977.
At the gathering, Fratianno received information from Cleveland boss James Licavoli that the family had a source inside the FBI, a female clerk who was providing documents and the code numbers of active informants to the mob. Fratianno understood immediately what this meant. If that source provided his name, he was already dead. There was no time to wait and see how things developed. On November 29, 1977, Aladina Fratianno agreed to become a government witness. It was described at the time as a seismic event in the history of American organized crime. No acting boss of a mafia family had ever flipped before. The closest comparison was Joseph Valachi 14 years earlier, but Valachi had been a street-level soldier. Fratianno was in the upper tier of the national organization, with detailed knowledge of operations, personalities, and crimes across multiple cities and multiple families. What he knew covered decades of criminal activity from coast to coast. His cooperation was extensive and damaging. Over the following years, Fratianno testified in multiple trials and provided intelligence that led to prosecutions of senior organized crime figures across the country. His targets included Frank Thierry, the boss of the Genovese family in New York, who became the first American mafia boss ever convicted under the RICO statute in 1980, in large part because of Fratianno's testimony. He also helped convict Anthony Salerno, Joseph Aiupa of the Chicago outfit, Carmine Persico of the Colombo family, and his former boss, Dominic Bruglia, in Los Angeles. In exchange for his cooperation, Fratianno pleaded guilty to murder charges, but served only 21 months of a 5-year sentence, an arrangement that prosecutors justified based on the scale and significance of what he provided. In 1980, Fratianno entered the Federal Witness Protection Program with his second wife, Jean, whom he had married in 1975. He was placed in secure accommodations and operated as a paid informant for 10 years, providing ongoing intelligence to federal investigators. He became a long-term resident of what was informally referred to inside the federal prison system as the Valachi Suite at La Tuna Federal Correctional Institution in Texas, the same facility where Joseph Valachi had spent his final years. The nickname reflected the continuity of a tradition Valachi had started, senior mob figures spending the rest of their lives in comfortable federal custody in exchange for what they knew. During his years in witness protection, Fratianno cooperated with author Ovid Damaris on a book about his life titled The Last Mafioso, published in 1981. The book became a bestseller and provided the American public with the most detailed first-hand account of life inside the National Mafia network that had been published up to that point. Fratianno detailed murders, power struggles, the internal mechanics of multiple crime families, and the specific personalities who ran organized crime across the country. He remained in witness protection for the rest of his life. Aladina Fratianno died of natural causes in 1993 while living under an assumed identity. He was 79 years old. No successful retaliation was ever carried out against him, despite the enormous damage his testimony inflicted on families stretching from Los Angeles to New York to Chicago. The organizations he had helped build spent years after his cooperation trying to recover from the prosecutions his testimony enabled. Most never fully did. Fratianno got out because he saw the trap closing before it closed and moved first.
The next two people on this list did something that required a different kind of courage entirely. They were born into the mob, raised inside it, and had to make the decision to destroy their own family from the inside out. Case 8.
Frank Calabrese Jr., Chicago outfit. The son who wore a wire against his own father. Frank Calabrese Jr. did not choose the life. The life was chosen for him before he was old enough to understand what it meant. His father, Frank Calabrese Sr., was one of the most feared and violent figures in the Chicago outfit, the organized crime organization that had controlled Chicago for decades. Calabrese Sr. ran the Chinatown Crew, also known as the 26th Street Crew, operating an extensive loan sharking operation that extracted money from hundreds of borrowers at interest rates ranging from 1% to 10% per week. If borrowers could not pay, the crew seized their cars, their homes, and their businesses. Calabrese Sr. had told his crew members directly to do anything necessary to collect. He meant it literally. Growing up in that environment meant Frank Jr. absorbed the culture, the rules, and the violence as background noise. He was not recruited. He was inherited. His father brought him into the business as a matter of course, the same way another man might bring a son into a family trade. Frank Jr. worked within his father's crew, participating in the loan sharking operations and the street-level enforcement that kept them running. He was present for collections, understood the financial structures, and knew the people involved at every level of his father's operation. He also developed a cocaine addiction that would eventually become one of the central factors in everything that followed. Over a period of years, Frank Jr. stole hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash from his father to fund the addiction and cover bad business decisions. Frank Sr. discovered the thefts. The relationship between father and son became something that existed in the space between obligation and contempt. Frank Sr. kept his son close because keeping enemies closer was instinct, and because, within the outfit, family complications were handled internally. Frank Jr. stayed because leaving was not a concept that existed in that world without consequences. In 1995, the federal government indicted Frank Calabrese Sr. and 9 other organized crime figures for loan sharking and racketeering connected to an auto repair business in River Grove, Illinois. An owner of the business had become an undercover government informant and recorded meetings at a car dealership in Elmhurst. Among those arrested were Frank Sr., Frank Jr., and their brother and uncle, respectively, Nick Calabrese. Both Frank Sr. and Frank Jr. were sentenced to prison terms and ended up incarcerated together at the Federal Correctional Institution in Milan, Michigan. Being imprisoned alongside his father did not produce reconciliation. Frank Sr. used the proximity to continue exerting control. He tried to pull his son back into outfit business even from inside a federal prison. He passed instructions, maintained contact with people on the outside, and made clear that his expectation was that Frank Jr. would continue serving the organization's interests, regardless of the circumstances. Frank Jr. watched this and understood something clearly. As long as his father was capable of operating, he himself would never be free. The only exit was permanent. In July 1998, Frank Jr. sat down in the prison library, pulled on a pair of gloves to conceal his fingerprints, and typed a letter on an old Smith Corona manual typewriter addressed to the FBI's Chicago field office. The letter was careful, specific, and direct. It stated that he wanted to meet face-to-face, that he had information about his father's criminal activities, and that he could provide details about murders the government did not yet know about. It ended with a line that FBI agents would later describe as one of the most striking things they had ever received in a written communication from an informant. "This is no game. I feel I have to help keep this sick man locked up forever. FBI." Special Agent Michael Maseth was assigned to the case. He met with Frank Jr. and began building a picture of what was available.
What Frank Jr. described was substantial. Not just the loan sharking operations the government already knew about, but murders. Multiple murders. Unsolved killings going back decades that had never been connected to the outfit in any prosecutable way. The FBI made a decision. They asked Frank Jr. to wear a wire. He agreed. Inside the prison yard at Milan, Michigan, Frank Jr. began recording conversations with his father. He approached the interactions strategically, steering his father towards subjects that would produce usable evidence. Frank Sr., believing he was speaking privately with his own son, talked. He referenced murders. He discussed outfit operations. He confirmed details that the government had no other way of obtaining. Frank Jr. later described sitting in his cell afterward and crying, torn between the knowledge that he was doing the right thing and the reality that every conversation he recorded was another nail in his father's coffin. One of the most significant developments came from Frank Jr. deliberately provoking his father's anger about his uncle, Nick Calabrese. Frank Sr., when agitated about his brother, became loose with information. The FBI recognized what was happening and built on it. When Agent Mayseth subsequently approached Nick Calabrese directly and confronted him with DNA evidence linking him to the 1986 murder of mob enforcer John Feccarata, Nick began talking. He did not stop for a long time. He described 14 murders in which he had personally participated, providing the FBI with details about killings that had gone unsolved for up to 3 decades. The investigation that grew out of Frank Jr.'s letter became known as Operation Family Secrets. In April 2005, federal prosecutors filed a 43-page indictment that named the entire Chicago outfit as a criminal enterprise, an unprecedented legal move in Chicago mob history. 14 defendants were charged, connected to 18 murders and 1 attempted murder committed between 1970 and 1986, all carried out to protect and advance the outfit's loan sharking and bookmaking operations. The trial began in June 2007 and lasted nearly 2 months. Prosecutors called 125 witnesses and presented over 200 pieces of evidence. Frank Jr. and Nick Calabrese both testified. The trial included the first eyewitness account ever given in a courtroom of the 1986 murders of Anthony Spilatro and his brother Michael, the killings that Martin Scorsese had depicted fictionally in his 1995 film Casino. Nick Calabrese described holding Michael Spilatro's legs as he was strangled in the basement of a suburban Chicago home. Anthony Spilatro had asked for a moment to say a prayer before he was killed. On August 30, 2007, all 5 principal defendants were found guilty on all counts. Frank Calabrese Sr. was sentenced to life in prison on January 28, 2009. Judge Zagel, sentencing him, described his crimes as unspeakable and listed 13 separate murder convictions against him. Joseph Lombardo received life. James Marcello received life. Frank Calabrese Sr. died in federal prison on December 25, 2012, at the age of 75. Frank Jr. received consideration for his cooperation and avoided the lengthy sentence that would otherwise have applied. He is still alive. He speaks publicly at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas on a regular basis, telling the story of growing up inside the Chicago outfit and the decision he made in that prison library in 1998. He has described the experience not as heroism, but as the only way he could see to finally live his own life. Frank Calabrese Jr. destroyed his father to save himself. The next person on this list was not trying to save himself at all. He was already deep inside the killing and had been for decades. And when the government finally cornered him with evidence he could not explain away, he made a decision that turned out to be the most devastating single act of testimony in Chicago mob history. Case 9. Nicholas Calabrese, Chicago outfit. The made man who admitted to 14 murders to escape. Nicholas William Calabrese was born on November 30, 1942, and grew up near the intersection of Grand and Ogden Avenues on Chicago's near West Side.
As a boy, he worked at a newsstand at the corner of Grand Avenue and State Street in downtown Chicago, the same corner where several of his brothers had worked before him. It was an ordinary beginning for a man who would eventually stand in a federal courtroom and describe, in calm and specific detail, how he had helped kill 14 people over the course of more than 2 decades. His older brother, Frank Calabrese Sr., was already embedded in the Chicago outfit by the time Nicholas came of age. The path from the near West Side newsstand to the outfit's criminal infrastructure was not a long one. Nicholas began assisting his brother in the late 1960s, helping with street tax collections, the extortion payments the outfit demanded from businesses operating in their territory, and with the enforcement side of the juice loan operation. Juice loans were high-interest loan sharking arrangements that charged borrowers rates no legitimate lender would touch, and collecting on them required people willing to use violence. His first involvement in murder came in 1970. He was approximately 27 years old. A man named Michael Albergo, suspected of being an informant, was targeted for execution near Comiskey Park on Chicago's South Side. Nicholas held Albergo's arms while Frank Sr. strangled him with a rope and then cut his throat. The body was buried in a forest preserve. Nicholas later testified that he was overtaken by fear during the killing and lost control of his bodily functions. He did not stop participating in murders after that. Over the following 16 years, he was involved in 13 more. On October 9, 1983, Nicholas and Frank Sr. were both formally inducted as made members of the Chicago outfit during a ceremony conducted by boss Joey Ayupa at a restaurant on Roosevelt Road. Nicholas was now fully inside the organization in an official capacity, bound by the same oath that every made member took, a commitment to the outfit that superseded every other loyalty, including family, including self-preservation. The murder that would eventually unravel everything happened on August 14, 1986. John Feckerata was a Chicago outfit enforcer who had been involved in the Spilatro killings earlier that year. He had made a mistake during the disposal of evidence connected to those murders and had become a liability. Nicholas Calabrese was part of the crew assigned to kill him. The hit was carried out, but something went wrong during the execution. Feckerata scratched Nicholas on the hand while fighting back, and Nicholas bled at the scene. He did not know it at the time, but that blood would sit in evidence storage for over 15 years, waiting for DNA technology to catch up with it. The Spilatro killings Nicholas had been involved in earlier that same year were among the most significant mob murders in Chicago history. Anthony Spilatro had been the outfit's man in Las Vegas for years, overseeing their interests in the casino world. His brother Michael was also deeply involved in outfit operations. Both men had become problems, too visible, too reckless, and too connected to ongoing federal investigations. They were lured to a house in the Chicago suburbs in June 1986 under the pretense of a meeting about promotions within the organization. When Anthony Spilatro came down into the basement, he understood immediately what was happening. According to Nicholas Calabrese's later testimony, Anthony asked for a moment to say a prayer. Nicholas was too occupied helping kill Michael Spilatro to hear what happened to Anthony directly. James Marcello, who would later be convicted as the top boss of the outfit, was present and drove members of the crew to the location. The Spilatro brothers were beaten to death and their bodies buried in an Indiana cornfield. Martin Scorsese depicted fictionalized versions of these murders in his 1995 film Casino, but the actual first-hand account of what happened in that basement was not given publicly until Nicholas Calabrese testified in 2007. The moment the government's case against Nicholas became unavoidable came when FBI agents confronted him with the DNA evidence from the Feckerata murder scene. The blood found at the scene matched Nicholas Calabrese. There was no explanation available that would account for his presence at a murder scene in a way that did not end with a life sentence. Facing that reality, Nicholas began talking in 2002.
He described 14 murders in which he had personally participated. He provided names, dates, locations, and specific physical details that only someone present could have known. He identified who gave the orders, who drove the cars, who held the victims, and who delivered the killing blows. He named James Marcello, Frank Sr., Joseph Lombardo, and other senior outfit figures in connection with specific crimes. His testimony resolved 18 murders that had gone unsolved for as long as 3 decades. At the 2007 Family Secrets trial, Nicholas took the witness stand and delivered his account in a flat, matter-of-fact manner that courtroom observers found deeply unsettling. A Chicago Sun-Times reporter described him as looking more like a senior citizen heading out for an early bird dinner than an outfit killer. When a defense attorney pushed him on his characterization, Nicholas drew a distinction he considered meaningful.
He said he was a killer. He said he was not a serial killer. The difference, in his framing, was that he had killed on orders within an organizational structure rather than from personal compulsion. For 14 murders and decades of criminal activity, Nicholas Calabrese was sentenced on March 26, 2009 to 12 years and 4 months in prison. Judge Zagel acknowledged at sentencing that his cooperation had allowed families of murder victims to finally understand what had happened to people they had been searching for answers about for years. Nicholas Calabrese died on March 13, 2023, at the age of 80, in an undisclosed location under federal protection. He had outlived his brother Frank Sr., who died in prison on Christmas Day 2012, and outlived most of the men he had worked alongside and testified against. Nicholas Calabrese was the first fully made member in the history of the Chicago outfit to testify against the organization.
The last person on this list never killed anyone, never ran a crew, and was never inducted into anything. But he spent 6 years so deep inside one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in America that the people who trusted him most were destroyed when the truth finally came out.
Case 10. Vincent Teresa, Patriarcha Crime Family, New England. The $10 million man who broke New England's mob, Vincent Charles Teresa, was born in 1928 in the Boston area of Massachusetts into a family that was already connected to organized crime before he was old enough to understand what that meant. His uncle was a member of the Patriarcha Crime Family, the organized crime organization that controlled New England, covering Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, with an iron grip that extended from street-level gambling operations all the way up to political corruption and contract murder. Teresa grew up watching men from that world move through his family's life as a matter of routine. They were not strangers or outsiders. They were relatives and neighbors and family friends. He was arrested for burglary before he was 20. He was expelled from school. He received a dishonorable discharge from the United States Navy. By any conventional measure, his early life was a series of failures and collisions with authority. Inside the Patriarcha world, none of that disqualified him. It was practically a resume. Teresa became affiliated with the Patriarcha family in his early years and built a reputation as one of the most creative and productive earners the organization had ever produced. He was not primarily a violent enforcer, though violence was always available as a tool when needed. His real value was in generating money. He ran gambling operations, managed fraud schemes, orchestrated stock swindles, and operated counterfeiting operations with a scale and sophistication that made him genuinely unusual in the mob world. He was imaginative in ways that most organized crime figures simply were not, and the Patriarcha family gave him room to operate because the money he produced was too significant to restrict. By his own account, Teresa generated approximately $10 million for the Patriarcha family over the course of his criminal career. That figure covered decades of operations across multiple states and into international territory. He ran schemes that moved stolen securities across borders, organized theft rings that targeted specific high-value goods,
and built criminal enterprises that operated with enough complexity to confuse law enforcement investigators who were more accustomed to straightforward loan sharking and numbers operations. Raymond Patriarca Sr., the boss of the family who ran the New England organization from Providence, Rhode Island for decades, considered Teresa a valuable asset. Teresa operated with significant latitude precisely because he kept producing. The relationship was transactional in the way all mob relationships ultimately are. Teresa earned, the family took its share, and the arrangement continued as long as it was profitable for everyone involved.
The arrangement collapsed in the late 1960s.
Teresa was arrested and facing a serious federal sentence. The specific charges related to his fraud and theft operations, which had by that point attracted sustained federal attention. The prospect of spending the next significant portion of his life in federal prison forced a recalculation. Teresa was not a young man with decades ahead of him to absorb a long sentence and come out the other side. He was middle-aged, he had a family, and he had spent years watching what happened to people who went away for extended periods. Their operations dissolved, their money disappeared, and the organization moved on without them. In 1970, Teresa was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for his fraud and theft activities. Facing that sentence, he made his decision.
In 1971, he agreed to cooperate with federal authorities and became one of the first significant figures in the Patriarca crime family to break the organization's code of silence. What he provided to investigators covered the full breadth of the New England operation. Teresa knew where the money came from, how it moved, who authorized what, and which members of the family were connected to which crimes. He described the internal structure of the Patriarca organization, its relationship with other crime families along the East Coast, and the specific operations that had generated millions of dollars over the preceding decades. His testimony resulted in prosecutions of Patriarca family members and gave federal investigators a detailed picture of how the New England mob actually functioned. He was placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program and given a new identity. In 1973, working with journalist Thomas Renner, Teresa published a book titled My Life in the Mafia. It was one of the first-person accounts of life inside the American Mafia ever published, appearing 5 years after the Valachi papers and providing a different perspective. Not from a New York street soldier, but from a New England earner who had operated at the intersection of criminal enterprise and legitimate business for decades. The book was detailed, specific, and written in accessible language that reached a wide general audience. It remains one of the primary first-hand sources on the Patriarca family's operations during the post-war decades. Teresa's cooperation extended beyond American borders. He testified in criminal proceedings in the United Kingdom and Australia, making him one of the few American mob informants whose value to law enforcement crossed into international jurisdictions. Both cases involved organized crime operations with connections to the networks Teresa had operated within during his criminal career. Raymond Patriarca Sr. died of a heart attack in 1984, having never been directly brought down by Teresa's testimony, though the damage Teresa's cooperation did to the organization's operations and personnel was real and lasting. The Patriarca family continued to exist after Teresa's defection, but never recovered the reach and cohesion it had possessed during the years Teresa had helped build it. Vincent Teresa died in 1990 while still in witness protection, under an assumed identity. The specific circumstances of his death and the location where he had been living were not made public. He had entered the mob through a family door that was already open before he was born, earned more money for the organization than almost anyone in its history, and then walked out through a federal courthouse carrying everything he knew. 10 people on this list found a way out of worlds that were specifically designed to have no exits. Some of them made it cleanly. Some of them carried the consequences for the rest of their lives. None of them had an easy road on the other side. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.